First, I put my glasses on so I can see who falls asleep. And then we start. Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. Where'd I put the thing? How can I always lose the things right before... It's ridiculous. If anybody sees a missing remote thingamajiggy, it was stolen from me by somebody. Ah, here it is. Okay, now we start. Sorry, guys. So, my name is Aaron Greenwald. It's on the screen. And we're going to talk about React Native. And people are still coming in. That's so exciting. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, intro. So, this is Introduction to React Native. We're going to talk a little bit about what React Native is, why you might be interested in it, how it fits into the ecosystem, etc. A little bit about me, because that's the custom. I work at Wix, which is a consumer software company in Tel Aviv. We have offices in Vilnius and a couple other places. We build a platform for users to build their online presence and manage their businesses online, blah, 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 other kinds of stuff. Yeah, that's what we do. And I work on mobile apps right there. You can go to the App Store, download the Wix app from Android, iOS. That's the app that my team builds. Well, before we start, a quick survey. How many people here already use React Native? Exactly 2. Okay. And if I can't see in the back, so I don't know. I'm not discounting you. And how many people here are native app developers? Android, iOS? Okay, good number. And web developers? Quite a few. Excellent. So this is a great audience. I'm very, very excited. I hope we have good questions at the end. If we don't, I'm going to be very, very disappointed, so please no sleeping. React Native, you've heard all about it. You've heard the hype. Everybody talks about it. It's the next big thing. If you don't learn it right now, you're going to be obsolete. Some 22-year-old's going to throw you out, even though you've been in the business for 40 years, doing Android development for 50. I don't know. Careful. You need to know React Native. Why? Why should you care? That's what I was asking myself when this all started, and that's what we're going to try to address today. This is Facebook's definition for React Native. Okay, a framework for building native apps with React. It's lifted right off their GitHub page. Now, first of all, already, if you're a React developer, this is notable because React developers love saying that React is not a framework, it's a library, you only do Vue. But right here, Facebook tells you that it's a framework. And it's a framework because it gives you an end-to-end entire ecosystem for developing and shipping applications, native applications, that's what they say, using React. What's the status? It's very popular and increasingly stable. I used to say that it was young and unstable. And, you know, there were bugs, all kinds of bugs, and every couple of weeks it changed. That's been getting a lot better. It's pretty mature. I just checked today. They're up to almost 50,000 stars on GitHub. I remember the day they passed jQuery and stars. It was a big deal. They're way past that now. If you haven't heard about it, you're probably living under a rock or not a native app developer, I think. And it's pretty solid. If you're anything like me, this is what you say right away, okay? Cool. So somebody gives me a way to develop a native application without doing a native application. I've heard that before, and it didn't work out so well. Anybody here use any of these? Exactly. Okay, quick, hold your hands up. And now of you, how many people, if you had to do it, would do it again? Okay, fine, cool. I don't judge. I'm very, very open-minded, and but we can have a talk afterwards. This is an incomplete list. I just Googled frameworks to make native applications using JavaScript or something like that, and I got this list, and I just slapped it on the screen. And this is a problem for React Native, because React Native comes onto the scene in 2014 and says, hey guys, I have this kind of new cool shiny thing, and everybody's like, okay, we've seen this before. And by and large, the industry has looked at these solutions and said, not really that great, okay? Sure, people use them. Many people use them. You probably have on your phone right now some apps that were developed using possibly PhoneGap, for example. But Facebook's not using it to develop their apps, and Google's not using it to develop their apps, and anybody who's looking for a first-class user experience is going to build native apps the traditional or the right way. And all of these are nice shortcuts, but they just don't really get you where you want to be. So what you have to be asking yourself right now is, why should I be interested in something new? Why should I be interested in another attempt to solve a problem that nobody ever successfully solved before? Probably because it's unsolvable. How does it differ, in short? Well, essentially 2 things, okay? If I had to categorize what makes React Native unique, it is number 1, the difference between a web view and a native view. What's a web view? Okay, most of you probably know, but to run through it a little bit briefly, imagine I go to the App Store. I have an Android because I'm cheap, and I go to the App Store and I download an app, and I feel like it's got a million downloads and reviews and all this. It's an app. I'm downloading an app, and I am. And then when I open it, all it really is a website stuck inside the shell of an app. That's a web view. Okay, it runs HTML and JavaScript and CSS and all that stuff. The user may feel at first like they're downloading a native app, but it's not really a native app. And that accounts for, not all the things in the previous list were built on web views, many of them are. That accounts for a lot of the issues that we face in all of those previous frameworks, because web views have inherent problems. When I, as a user, take my phone out and interact with it, a mobile device, I expect a level of interaction that the web cannot provide and was not built to provide. Let's think about animations, for example. Typical animations in the web are CSS transitions, okay? You know that you have a state that starts this way, it's going to be this, and let's do some kind of interpolation. Let's do an ease-in interpolation between those two states. That's great. It's beautiful. But it's not what we think of when we think of animations in mobile. In mobile, we have gestures. I have pinch. I have zoom. I can spin my fingers and do all kinds of cool things, and I expect those things to respond as if they are one with my finger. I expect the device and the application to respond as if it does know exactly where my finger is, and it follows my gestures. And I expect it to respond at 60 frames per second. And a lot of the problem that we face with these kinds of attempts to mimic a native application with a web view, it comes down to performance and the ability to give a user the kind of interaction they want. React Native says, forget it. We're going to do this only with native UIs. Every single UI, you touch, you see, you look at, you feel, you experience inside of a React Native app is a regular, old-fashioned Android or iOS UI. That's it. And we'll talk momentarily about how they achieve this magic. And the second thing has to do with this line. Now, if you are a Java developer, you probably heard a lot about this line. And after a while, it became a joke. Write once, run anywhere turned into write once, run nowhere because it just didn't work. And so React Native lowers the bar. React Native says, I'm not going to be able to write once, run anywhere. Instead, I'll tell you, you can learn once, write anywhere. What does this mean? What this means is that I'm not promising you, React Native says, that you'll have a single app that you can deploy to Android and iOS. Because if I promised you that, I wouldn't be able to achieve it. And I don't want to make a promise I cannot make. Instead, I'm going to tell you that you'll have two apps. You'll have an Android app, you'll have an iOS app. They'll be different because your users need different things. There will be two separate binaries, two separate distributions, two separate applications. But you'll only have to learn one stack to build those two apps. That means that if you're a developer, you have one skill set, one mindset, one frame of reference, one IDE experience. You open up your IDE in the morning, you start working, you fix a bug in Android, then you go write a feature in iOS, you switch back and forth, no problem, it's seamless. Are there two apps? Yes. Can I give you a write once, run anywhere experience? React Native says we're not going to even try that, because if we tried that, we'd probably fail. It is my view that this lowering of expectations is the critical aspect of what makes React Native at least a candidate for success where all other frameworks failed, because they don't try to do too much. So those are the two main differentiators, I would say, when it comes to React Native versus all of the other attempts at hybrid frameworks. That sounds like a tall order still. How does that work? Like this, right? Simple. What happens? Not so simple. I exaggerate. You have two threads on your phone, okay? First of all, already a big improvement over the web because on the web there's only one thread. But you have two threads on your phone. One is running a JavaScript engine, and the other is running a native UI. The native UI is just a regular native application. Let's take iOS application, for example. It's just a native iOS application. But there is, inside every iPhone, a JavaScript engine, okay? And in Android, React Native apps ship with a JavaScript engine. Think of it like V8 or like Chrome. It's a JavaScript engine that can run JavaScript. And it runs React. But it also runs all your business logic. So what happens? These two things communicate over a bridge. The bridge is just a protocol for asynchronous serialized batch communication between these two threads. What does that mean? That means that when the user looks at your app and say clicks something, taps a touchable, okay, or something that responds, that event gets, in this case there might only be one event, but if there were a few events, that would get serialized into what's essentially JSON as the transport protocol, sent over the bridge in a batch of all the changes that just happened, all the events that just happened, to the JavaScript side. The JavaScript side then responds to that with whatever hooks that then bubble up to your code. Your code can do whatever it needs to do. It can go fetch data, do what, who knows what, calculate what it needs to calculate. React kicks in and figures out what needs to be changed on the UI. Again, batches up those changes, serializes them to JSON, sends them over the bridge, and the native UI responds to those. So in this sense, all of this part of the framework, the only thing you have to write basically is your JavaScript logic. You write your JavaScript logic, you respond to events. The events are happening on the native side, but then being sent across the bridge to you. And then you again send events back over the bridge. User always interacts with a native application, and you write code that runs inside the JavaScript engine on a separate thread, so it never blocks the UI. Whatever logic you're doing, whatever data fetching you're doing will never block a user interaction. That's the idea anyway. I think the more important question for us as developers, and the reason that we might come to React Native, is not how it works under the hood, but how does it feel? Why might I use it? What is the experience like developing React Native? It's utter bliss. I exaggerate again, but it's pretty cool. Because again, those of you who are iOS developers, raise your hands. Nobody? Some people, in the beginning, people said they were native developers. Everybody does Android? Okay, we have a few people. Now, you people probably like working in Xcode. I see, because it's on the screen, and you know I'm going to shame you, so you don't raise your hands. But I'm not going to shame you, really. I'm very, 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 I don't know, like sensitive. I don't know, yeah. So maybe not. Okay. The point here is not that you can't use Xcode to develop. You just don't have to. And the same goes for Android Studio. One of the key features of React Native is that it's giving you a development experience that is much more open than traditional native development gives you. You can develop the way you like to develop. I use WebStorm, but some people on our team use IntelliJ, and other people use Visual Studio Code, and you can use whatever you want, because at the end of the day, most of what you're doing is just JavaScript, so you can do it anywhere. What happens? This is your IDE, okay? And it's just totally vague and generic because it's whatever your IDE is. And you write code, you click save, and your IDE, and immediately the packager kicks in. The packager is kind of like Webpack, but not Webpack because Facebook said it wasn't fast enough. And the React Native packager essentially looks at all your code, watches for changes, then runs over all the code, bundles it up into a single file, minified or not minified, depending on whether you're in debug mode, and serves this single bundle file, we call it the bundle.js, serves this single file, which contains everything that, all the JavaScript that your app needs to run on, while you're developing on your localhost port 8081. Then you open, say, typically a simulator or an Android emulator on your machine, and it loads up a native application, which is just a shell. The native application is a shell that can host that bundle file. It goes ahead and loads, because you're in development mode, goes ahead and loads this big file from port 8081 and runs your app, okay? But there's one more piece. Remember I said that the bridge is just a transport protocol for your UI to talk to your JavaScript engine? What if, some people said, instead of the JavaScript engine being inside your phone, at least for development mode, we put the JavaScript engine somewhere everybody knows and loves, in Chrome. Chrome has probably the best bug tools in the web today. If you're a web developer, then you probably love going to Chrome. You open up in Chrome, you open the console, you can put breakpoints, you can read the code, you can do all kinds of nice things. Oh, and of course, any console log primitive debugging you have will print out on the console right there. And so that's much more convenient than having it run inside some kind of JavaScript engine inside the device that you can't really access. So for development mode, we add Chrome into the mix, and we actually, it's just a tiny bit slower, we actually run all of that JavaScript side of the bridge inside Chrome, literally inside Chrome. So any console log you put prints inside Chrome. Any breakpoints you put will print in Chrome. And at the same time, of course, all your native code runs inside the simulator or emulator, and the app runs across this WebSocket. How does that look? Like this. This is a video because I don't have the courage to live code. And this is pretty old, but it's an application that we work on, or an old version of the application. You can see a terminal open with running the packager and serving this file. When I loaded the application, I just hit refresh. It actually loaded a new version of the file from the terminal. I opened some dev tools that come with the development mode, and you can see that I have on already Chrome debugging and live reload. So this is the debug version of the app running locally inside a simulator from the packager that's running inside a terminal. And what typically happens is here you see WebStorm. Somebody comes and says they don't like the background color of the app. So we'll zoom in a little bit and find where the background color is defined. This is just React. So here, let's press background color, bunch of A's, click save, live reload clicks in, and I get a red screen of death, which you get a lot in React Native. But what's nice about it is it actually tells you exactly what you did wrong. What I did wrong was, I only have 5 A's when I need 6 A's. This isn't a valid hex code, so I'll fix that. Click save again, live reload, and voila. It's beautiful, right? Except my designer thinks I'm crazy and doesn't agree. So I changed the color again, click save, and way ugly, right? The other one was much nicer. So she says, okay, you're not designing anything. I'll get back to you with the right color. So I just put it back to whatever color I like, click save, and then I go on to go fix some bug. So I'll probably go to the console in a second, if the video can catch up with how fast I talk. And let's see what's in Chrome. I open the console, and you'll see tons and tons of logs that have been running this entire time, because the JavaScript part of this app was actually running in Chrome the entire time. And we'll print all kinds of debug logs. I can see what happened. I can see the error. As I interact with the app, I can see things populate inside the console. Just watch it right there. You can see all the state changes. We're using Redux in this case, and we're logging all the Redux state changes, etc. So if you're a native, those of you who said you're native developers, Android, iOS, you probably, thank you, are probably already seeing some huge value here, okay? The value proposition here is that the development lifecycle is so much faster. You want to change the color, you just change the color and it reloads and you see it in real time, no recompilation. I remember that XKCD, which is kind of famous, maybe a lot of you seen it, that says a bunch of programmers are playing with Nerf guns, and the manager comes in and says, what are you all doing? He says, code's compiling. Oh, okay, go back to playing. So the downside of React Native is less Nerf guns. But really, it's just a huge step forward in terms of the speed with which you can iterate on your development, especially on the UI layer, which is often kind of you're tweaking things, making small changes, seeing how they might play out and how they look. Look how fast it is. So when we talk about the advantages or the significant change that is React Native, I think that I don't typically, and I'm more than happy to talk about this should people challenge it, but I don't typically address why it's better than, say, PhoneGap, okay? Because I think that the fact that it gives you entirely native UI answers that question. I think the real question here is, why should I do React Native instead of just building an Android app or building an iOS app? What's the value add here? What's React Native's competitive advantage versus building a proper native app? Because React Native will give you a native app. At the end of the day, everything you interact with is native. But why are you doing it this kind of backwards way? Why don't you just write a native app if that's what you want? So the way I like to look at it is say, look, we need native apps. We know that. We know that the user experience that we get from web views is subpar. It's not something we're willing to settle for. Sometimes we are. In some use cases we are. But if we're looking for a first-class user experience, then web views aren't going to work for us. So we need a native app. But we hate writing them, because writing them is much more slow and much more expensive than writing web apps, for example, okay? People I've worked with, and I still work with many people from different backgrounds on React Native, and those who came from on the web have a very different perspective than those who came from mobile. Those who came from mobile are much more jaded and used to the kind of slow, difficult experience that mobile development brings with it. It's just harder to deploy. It's harder to develop. It takes longer. It's just much more clumsy. The web is some kind of almost perfected science of continuous delivery. So we don't like writing native apps. What React Native offers us is a way out of this. Number one, of course, this is small, but it's a smoother transition from the web. If you have a lot of web developers, I mean, it's just JavaScript. Of course, it's a little bit different, but still, if you're a web developer, your skills are much more transferable when you come to React Native than if you just try to learn Objective-C or even Swift and Java. It lets you use the richest ecosystem this is. This is a big deal. I always say that on days that LeftPad isn't unpublished, NPM is the most, I don't have a better word for rich, so I'm going to use it again, even though it's on the slide. It's the richest ecosystem there is. There are so many libraries. Anything you look for is there. Anything you can possibly want is there, and probably in 4 different versions that you now have to choose between. But that's a separate problem. It just gives you access to so much code. It allows you to develop quickly. We saw that in the video. It allows you to deploy like you're on the web. Why? Because think about this. I told you that in development mode, the bundle file is served from port 8081. And it's just run locally. And you saw, I clicked Command R, and the simulator reloaded the bundle file. Of course, in production, that can't work that way. It's not going to hit a server every time, right? What's it going to do? Well, when you ship the app, it'll ship a copy of the version of the bundle file. But what if, the developers say, what if we ship a copy of the bundle file, but then every time you load the app, it goes and checks if there's a new version. It treats the local version like a cache. It checks if there's a new version, if there is, on some server somewhere, like a CDN. It downloads it and then runs an updated version of the app in real time. And if it doesn't have a new version, then it runs what it has. That's great. Now you can fix a bug or tweak features or change the color of the background if you should so desire and deploy it just like that. Push a new version to your CDN and your users, the next time they open the app, have a new version. And this is possible with React Native. It's a big deal, actually. People often ask, is this allowed? Does Apple allow it? Yes, they do, currently anyway. Android certainly allows it. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. But essentially, it's possible. And Microsoft has an entire business called CodePush that is, or a suite of products that they're supposed to somehow make money on that is built around this concept for pushing versions to React Native. Of course, it gives you the ability to reuse skill sets across Android and iOS. What's not to like? And finally, it allows you to reuse code. I leave this for the end, even though it's a big deal. I mean, you get to have the same code that runs on, or in a large part, very similar code that runs on Android and iOS because most of your business logic is reusable. I leave it for the end because I think that even if this wasn't one of the benefits, and I don't include it in like the 2 big things that React Native offers, because even if this didn't exist, React Native would still be worthwhile in my opinion. This is, to my mind, every time you get to reuse code across Android and iOS, you're getting a freebie, a bonus, where you can say, hey, I don't need 2 versions of the, I don't really, even though I have 2 versions of the app, I don't need 2 completely separate versions of the app. Much of it overlaps. So if we come back to our primary issue, which is that we need mobile apps, but we hate writing them, we see that we've solved all of these with these 5 big benefits I showed you. We've solved these problems because what we've done is give your users the user experience of native, but your developers the developer experience of the web. That's what we're going for. That's what React Native is really about. Okay? The user experience of native, your users should not just feel like they have a native app, but actually have a native app. But your developers should, as much as possible, feel like they're developing on the web, which is much faster, lighter, and dare I say fun. I hope I don't offend anybody. 1 second, I'm going to take a drink. So, don't make fun, but I live in Israel now, but I used to live in the United States, which is evident from this. But when I came to Europe like a few weeks ago, I was in Amsterdam, and I ordered a soda, and they gave me 200. I don't know what 200 milliliters is, by the way, because it's not. It's like whatever the metric system. But whatever it is was very small. Okay, I was very disappointed. I hope also that doesn't offend anybody. But like, can you give me 200 milliliters? Anyway, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, React Native. So people ask this a lot. What if it limits me? Why? Because it's a legitimate concern. I mean, think about this. How many frameworks have you tried in your career that promise you everything and then get you, say, 80% of the way there for free and make maybe the next 10% difficult and the last 10% just impossible? That's the nature of a lot of frameworks. I remember the first time I used Microsoft Light Switch, it was like that. 80% of the way there for free, the last 10%, good luck. And so people often are afraid, okay, great. React Native seems cool. I'll try it out. I'll do a POC. Everything will work. And 6 months down the line, I'm going to need something, and I'm not going to be able to do it. Oh, shoot. Well, what are we going to do? Rewrite our app now? No, we're going to sacrifice an experience. Everybody's going to be upset, but we have no choice. And then I'm going to be the one that's fired for being the one that picked React Native. So you don't want to pick React Native, right? Because you don't want to be fired. At least I don't. So it's a legitimate concern people often have. And I tell you that it won't limit you. Not because the React Native is awesome and React Native has everything you can possibly need, but by definition, it cannot limit you because React Native does not tell you we're going to give you an API for everything you need to do. That's not the promise. React Native also doesn't tell you that you can't write native code. In fact, writing native code might actually be part of working with React Native. What do I mean? You see, how does React Native really work under the hood? You have React, okay, and you say, give me a view. Give me, instead of divs, give me a view. Instead of image with img, give me image, like the full word written out. Give me all these React components. And then what happens? What happens is there's an implementation detail. It's an implementation detail, but there's an implementation for view that translates on iOS to UI view controller or something like, I don't remember exactly, but it translates to something in iOS and it translates to something else in Android. Okay, and the same for image. It translates to something in iOS and something in Android. And you can always write your own. That's all React Native is, a wrapper around native views. And there's nothing that stops you from writing your own. In fact, you're encouraged to do so. Because at the end of the day, React Native isn't about not writing native code. It's about having native code and then using that native code in JavaScript. The things that are best written natively should be written natively. Many of them, most of them, will be written natively for you already because Facebook did most of it, plus there's tons of third-party libraries. But you might, at some point, decide, oh, I need this to be implemented on the native side. I'm going to implement it natively, and then I'll expose hooks to the JavaScript, and everything will be great. That's not, and people often say this, oh, this particular part of the code I can't write in React Native, I'm going to do this natively. No, that's a mistake. Because when you do it natively, you're also doing it in React Native. To do it natively is not to go away from React Native. That's what React Native is about. React Native is about making conscious decisions about what's best implemented on the JavaScript side of the bridge and what's best implemented on the native side of the bridge. And there are plenty of talks on YouTube that you can find that talk a lot about this issue because performance can be a problem. Some things are not, you can't do in JavaScript. For example, animations. The animations, you don't want to actually calculate the animations on the JavaScript side. You want to send the spec of the animation across the bridge and have the native side calculate the animations. And that's good. That's what you should do. And so most of the time, you'll use libraries that will do this for you, but you always have an escape hatch. You can always write native code. You can glue together native code and JavaScript code. You can take an existing brownfield app and smack on some React Native screens. It's all legal because a React Native app at the end of the day is just a native app with some logic outsourced to another thread that happens to run in JavaScript. Think of it that way. And so React Native can't limit you because it doesn't make a statement about where you should write all your code. So does it sound too good to be true? Maybe. Maybe it promises all this, but it doesn't live up to its expectations. And that's a concern that you also might have. And I'll be frank with you. I mean, I don't make any money off React Native. I don't know if anybody does. But I don't care if you use it or not. And so I'm not sure it's the best thing that will ever be out there. But right now, I think it's the best thing. Even so, I'll tell you that it's still not web development. There are some gaps in how well it reaches its goal of giving you the developer experience of the web. Meaning, you can't always code push. Okay, I told you, you can push code. Great. So when I have a bug fix, I'll just push it out. Which, by the way, is not just good for fixing the bug, but good for development too. Because when I have the confidence that if there's a bug, I'll just push it out and 5 minutes later, I can develop much more quickly. One of the problems we have with mobile often is we have to test much more thoroughly because if I let this bug out the door, who knows when it'll be upgraded. I don't know if those of you who are mobile developers, you hopefully have stats on how fast your users update. And we gather that kind of stats, and we know that right after a new version comes out, some percentage of people will upgrade within a day or so, and some people never update. Okay, months later, they're still on an old version, and they still have that bug, and it could be a huge problem. And so code push really saves you not just from the bugs, but also allows you to develop much more quickly and much more brazenly. At the same time, you can't always do it. Why? Because at the end of the day, the more code that you implemented natively, that's more code that you can't code push. You can only code push the stuff you implemented in JavaScript. You can't push out changes to binaries. If you have a change to binaries, then you have no choice but to wait for your user to upgrade, and you're at your user's mercy. And so here is some pressure, or so to speak, to get as much of your code as possible in the JavaScript side, but at the end of the day, some changes will not be code pushable. styling is different. So those of you who raise your hand and said you're web developers, let's do another survey. How many of you like CSS? Okay. Now, how many of you know CSS? Okay. So most people, maybe I shouldn't say this because this is going to be on video and I don't know. But I don't really know CSS. Every time I'm doing CSS, it's just like, oh, let's put 8 properties here and try to get this thing centered. And oh, crap, it's not centered. I don't know why. I'll add another 3 properties. And eventually, after like you comment out all the different combinations of possible properties, the thing is centered. All right, we're just not going to touch it. Okay. Most of the time when I'm doing CSS, I'm guessing. And I think a lot of people work that way because it's such a complicated and difficult thing to, like sometimes you need to put, oh, you'll go to Stack Overflow and be like, yeah, no problem. You just got to make a div and put the other div inside the div and then put this property on the outer div and this property on the inner div and then you get what you want mostly, but not on all browsers. And it's frustrating, right? So when you get to React Native, it attempts to solve a lot of those problems by giving you a much stricter environment. Another thing React Native does for you in styling, in addition to a much stricter environment in terms of the confusion of all these different properties, it also has no inheritance, which means that if you were to put font size 45 on some kind of outer component, in the web, all the inner components would have font size 45 unless it overrides that. On React Native, you'll get an error if you put it on anything other than text. They'll say, well, you can't put font size on something that's not text, and it won't trickle down. Okay, it's much stricter. There's much more scoping, which will save you from a lot of bad bugs, but it'll often be very frustrating because a lot of the hacks and tricks and shenanigans that you got used to from your days as a web developer will no longer work, and you'll either have to learn to do things the right way, you'll have to learn Flex, and you might have to learn new shenanigans. So that presents a learning curve. It also requires you to think about your platforms, okay? And I don't mean Android versus iOS, but I mean mobile versus the web. When you're on the web, for example, you rarely think about what happens when the user's offline. If the user's offline, the application doesn't work. You don't come to my web app if you're not online. But in mobile, it's not like that. If you're offline, you expect that the app will allow you to still do some things and give you some kind of user experience. Like if you're sending a message, maybe it'll queue it up, it'll tell you. And as a mobile developer, now even if you came from the web and you're like, oh, no problem, it's React Native, I just need to learn JavaScript. No, now you're a mobile developer. Now you need to think about mobile in a new way. You need to think about your users in a new way. You need to think about the implications of how iOS iPhone users expect, what they expect from their devices, what Android users expect from their devices, and meet them where they are. And finally, debugging really isn't all there. In the web, we have great debugging tools. In React Native, they've been getting better, but they're still not there. It's still harder to debug a React Native app. It takes more time to chase down bugs than I've ever spent on web development. And so I need to tell you these 4 caveats because I don't want you to think, well, no problem, I'll go to React Native and it solves all my problems for me. It doesn't, okay? It gets you a lot of what you need, but it's not really the developer experience of the web as much as it tries to accomplish it and does a fairly good job, I might say. So this is the ultimate question, should you use it? The answer is always the same, it depends, okay? Depends on what you're doing. That's always the answer, so it's a cop-out. But it's true, okay? You need to think about, is what you're doing a good fit for React Native? But that aside, yeah, I think you should, okay? I think the results speak for themselves. Why? Well, this is a version of our app from a little while ago. It's GIFs. It's actually from Christmas time, so that's a really long time ago now in development world. And you can see these. I'm doing the same functionality in Android and iOS. And what you pay attention to, if you're looking carefully, the GIFs are not exactly the highest quality, but I assure you that the animations, and we're all more than welcome to check out the app on my phone afterwards. The animations are 60 frames per second. It's a fully native feel and a fully native experience. The other thing that you need to pay attention to is how the iOS app looks like iOS, because it is. The Android app looks like Android, and it feels like Android. The iOS app feels like iOS. There's nothing in it that makes you feel like the app was compromised because it's one code base. And it is one code base, and about 90 to 95% of the code is the same. Okay? The other thing that you'll notice here is some of these, like the way the navigation works. The navigation uses a library called React Native Navigation, which is open source and developed at Wix, and is an example of how you can achieve proper native implementations while still using React Native. So I think React Native makes a very compelling experience, very compelling argument for how you can give your users the user experience of the web. I'm sorry, of native. Which leads you to the final question I often get asked was, okay, fine, so does that mean that native developers are obsolete? Do we need them? Are they good for anything? And what often is the subtext of this is fear. Nobody wants to be obsolete. Certainly not me. And people often wonder, what happens now? So the good news for native developers is no, they're not obsolete because of what I mentioned earlier. React Native does not try to convince you never to write native code. It tries to give you the options to do what's best in native side and what's best in JavaScript side. JavaScript is really good at certain things. It's fast to develop, and it's good at business logic. Okay, native is where you do UI stuff. And I think that if you're a small team, okay, if solo developer, right, you can probably get by with that. Not probably, you can almost certainly build a pretty solid React Native app. For sure now, where the ecosystem is pretty rich, you can develop a solid React Native app without a single native developer. Because you'll use third-party libraries, you'll get everything you need. Okay? But if you're developing something big, if you're Facebook or Microsoft or Google or Wix, at some point you're going to need native developers. We have quite a few native developers on staff that do things for us, like these kinds of very sophisticated UI things and stuff that we can't find implementations for out there. Typically, the stuff that we do there, because it's just UI stuff, will be open source, and then over time, more, as the community can use a lot of that stuff, so you need them less. But if you're a growing team, I would tell you, and this is just my recommendation, that if you have 10 developers working on an app, which is a lot, very few apps are like that, but if you ever get to 10 developers, you should have at least one iOS specialist and one Android specialist on that team, because sometimes you'll need to use that escape hatch, and you'll need to dig deeper, and you'll need to really understand the platform. Because it's not just a bunch of web views that abstract everything away from you. It doesn't hide the native from you. In some places it does, but at the end of the day, it's a native app, and you need to understand the way native apps work, or at least somebody in your team needs to. So I'm going to give you a little bit more aggressive and say, if you get to 5 developers, you should have at least one Android or one iOS person, because there will be work that native developers still need to do, but much less of it. So if we have to reiterate, and we do have to reiterate before we stop, so we're going to reiterate. 2 main things I want you to take from here, if you remember anything. 1, React Native is about learn once, write anywhere. We're not promising you the world. We're not promising you that you can have one app that will be everything. You'll still have 2 apps for 2 app stores. Each app will be its own thing. People are yawning, so I'm going to go fast. I'm not guilting you. I'm just saying. And learn once, write anywhere. You'll have one skill set, one stack, one environment, one mental model. And second of all, React Native is all about giving your users the experience of native, but your developers the experience of the web. And I'm Aaron Greenwald. This was Learn Once, Write Anywhere, and we'll take questions.
Cool. Why your presentation is lack of code examples? Is React Native is so complex?
Good question. Why no good examples? Because I think, it's a personal opinion. Whenever I'm at a talk and I see code examples, I don't really look at them. I kind of just say, okay, code. Because, and what I'm trying to, the code is not that complex. I'm more than happy to show it to you. In fact, if we have a moment, I'll even bring up our code base on the screen. But if not, you can come to my Mac and look at the code. But I think that I want to present you with a high-level view of what React Native offers and where it fits in the stack. The code base basically looks like a React app, which is kind of boring. And the implementation details, if you decide to use React Native, you'll find you'll Google what you need and you'll find the answers in Stack Overflow. So like but really, if you're skeptical of the promises it makes, I'm more than happy to show it to you.
Hello. So is the React Native application run after all within WebView, or is it true native?
True native, no web views. Actually, so you could, in theory, do a web view inside of React Native, but there's no point. Okay, your classic React Native app is entirely a native app at the end of the day, as far as the UI layer is working. It's basic. Think of it like taking a native application and outsourcing the business logic to another thread that happens to be implemented in JavaScript, and then having a communication layer between those two threads. Okay, but everything that's user interaction or everything that's on the screen that a user can touch or feel or smell, should that exist, that's all native. Okay, it's all, there's no web views.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
So at the end of the day, you have two apps for two app stores, right? So it's one bundle for each app store. What happens when the team gets bigger? Like, I guess that in weeks you work in a large team. So what happens then?
It's a good question, and it creates some complexity because at the end of the day, your app has to be just one file. It has to get boiled down, at least as we stand right now, to one file. But if you have many, many people working on a thing and many, many modules and many separate components, in fact, in Wix we have a distributed team. We have people working in different management structures, different organizations, different buildings, different countries and continents, I guess. So people all over the world, and each one's working on their own module that has to eventually become part of this one app. What you end up with is some kind of continuous integration system and build process. And it's a challenge, and will take more management. But if you have, if you have two people, then it's overkill and over-engineering. But if you have 20 or 30, I think we're at well over 20 developers, maybe close to 30, I don't know. Those people can all work separately, and then eventually it all becomes, in a build CI server, we're using TeamCity, but you can use whatever, it all becomes one file.
Okay. Hello. From build and deployment perspective, do we require Apple ecosystem in place, or it can be built without it, like in Ionic?
Good question. I wish. Unfortunately, Apple are still dicks, I guess. Am I allowed to say that word? I don't know. But they're difficult, and you can use React Native, for example, on a Linux system or a Windows system, but you won't be able to compile for iOS, which is a problem. And this is the, I suppose, downside of having a native app, because at the end of the day, it's a native app, and it has to be built like a native app. And even though, so we abstract away Xcode. I said you don't need Xcode. Well, every once in a while I do open Xcode to do some things because there are command line tools, Xcode build, and so all the command line tools kind of hide it, but sometimes things break and I open it up. So it doesn't totally abstract away the fact that it is an iOS app and it is an Android app. That's the cost. There are some proposed and actually growing solutions to this, like generic container apps that you can, so there's some exporter which you can look into. Basically, as I understand it, we don't use it, so I don't really know the details of it, but some kind of generic container app, so if your user has that generic container app, they can just load your bundle. So in theory, yeah, you can, but if you're going to do this seriously, you're unfortunately going to have to buy a Mac.
And you didn't explicitly mention support of Universal Windows platform, but React Native.
So theoretically, so good, very good. I don't know where Windows support is right now. I know Microsoft is working on it because they really want, and this is a huge opportunity for them to get people to actually make apps for Windows, because if it's all I have to do is add one more build step to my existing app, that would be great, right? And then why not make it for Windows? So they're working on it. Microsoft is working on it, and they contribute to React Native. I don't know what the status of it is, but in theory, it should be possible, because at the end of the day, that would be an implementation detail under the hood. For every native code you have, you need to have code for all the platforms.
Hello. I have to work on the project which which is the application which has to work almost 24/7 on the devices. I'm working on the Android side, and I have a colleague which working on iOS side. So I'm interested in is there efficient way to make the React Native app work in background for 24/7?
Okay, so background processes and things like that. At the end of the day, that background process will, you can try to make that background process run in JavaScript, and you can profile it. I haven't done it, but again, your escape hatch is always there. If, at the end of the day, everything has to become native because it has to run native code. So if your whole app, see, remember I said like it depends. What does it depend on? Right? Should you use React Native? If you're building something that is entirely all about user experience and there's really no special logic, like some apps, especially games, are often more UI than anything else. Okay? So you're going 90% of your code is going to be platform code, and the other 2% is going to be in JavaScript. Maybe it's not worth it. Most apps, though, including the most common apps in the App Store, which are the Google apps and Facebook Messenger and things like that, on WhatsApp, they're more logic than they are UI. There's a UI, and then there's all kinds of stuff. So in that case, or CRUD apps, obviously, are really good candidates, or chat apps or anything are good candidates for React Native. If your app is solely a background process, right? Sometimes you get these apps that are basically just some little thing, or like your flashlight app. Okay, I wouldn't, now they have native ones, but if you had a flashlight app, probably don't do that in React Native, because there's no point, right? If your whole thing is just something that after you go down the rabbit hole you realize has to be done in native, then maybe there isn't value. But if you have like a general app and there's one thing that you have to do native, so you can, you still do that part, and the rest of it you can do. So the answer is you kind of have to look into your specific use case. There won't be a limitation. The question is how much of it you'll, and the only way to answer performance questions is profiling. Do it and see. We have there.
So the current React Native version is 0 dot something. So is it production ready?
Wait, the current React, I'm sorry, I missed the current React Native version is
0 dot something.
Yes.
So it's not the final version or something.
Okay. So good question. This actually is a larger question that has to do with the conventions in the JavaScript world. Semver says that anything that starts with a 0 means not production ready, right? Except it became like cool among many communities to start everything with 0 and never reach 1.0 so that you can always make breaking changes. So they never upgrade to 1. But is it production ready? Yeah, I mean, we're in production. We've been in production for a while, and we're using React Native. Facebook itself is in production with React Native. Some of their apps, they say, are built entirely in React Native. Some are partially built in React Native. I think Groups Manager or something like that is entirely React Native. So it's production ready. At the same time, they don't promise, and in fact, they do have breaking changes between versions. And so we don't, for example, upgrade every single version, because upgrading it's been getting much better. It used to be like every version would come out like every 2 weeks there would be a new version and there would be huge breaking changes. Nowadays, I think they moved from once a month or once every 2 months, something like that. I think once a month. And the changes are minimal. They'll have a breaking change, they'll document it, you have to update XYZ, so it'll take you a few hours to upgrade, so maybe every 2 versions we upgrade or something like that. But it's definitely production ready, and even though they're not having breaking changes. Anybody else? I have someone there. Oh, we got a screensaver. Should we keep the screensaver or should I touch the thing?
My question is about, can we style our components with CSS3, or React Native has its own styling system?
No, you can't use CSS. It has its own styling system that looks and feels a lot like CSS until something doesn't work, and then you just curse. But because it's just JavaScript, and there isn't really any I mean, in theory they could have polyfilled, so to speak, the whole browser experience. They didn't, because they felt that CSS model is fairly broken, and I'm inclined to agree in many areas. So they modeled it after CSS, and like many of the property names, if you look at it in the codes I show you, again, I'll come up to me afterwards. I'll be on the 6th floor. I'll show you.
Okay, sure.
It kind of looks a lot like CSS, and the property, background color and font size and things like that. But it's JavaScript objects, and your numbers will be numbers and the strings. It's much stricter. It'll throw errors if you don't follow the rules, which is nice because the errors are very descriptive. They say that's not acceptable.
So they have its own implementation.
Yeah, its own implementation based on Flex. I can talk about it for a while, but yeah.
Okay, get it. Thank you.
Anybody else? Or
If
like to
any
drink soda?
short question.
If you don't have a short question, you can't ask it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so that's it. One more thing I'm going to say very, very quickly. I tend to speak quickly in English. I apologize. It's my native language. If anybody didn't understand anything, feel free to ask me afterwards. Also, you can write to me, and I promise I will write back slowly. 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 right back slowly, 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 right back slowly,